Elements, my dear Watson. Apologies to Conan Doyle because he never wrote that. This is going to be a whirlwind talk about metal. It actually came from seeing a metal sculpture by Gerald Laing titled Flat Pyramid. Gold is for the mistress, silver for the maid, copper for the craftsman cunning at his trade. Good, said the baron, sitting in his hall, but iron, cold iron, is master of them all. That was Rudyard Kipling in 1910 with his poem Cold Iron. Metal things surround us, some metals we covet. Some of the obvious ones Kipling mentions in his poem. However, there are other metals that people have and still fight wars to control and supply them. Ytterbium, lutetium, erbium, these are just three metals, some of the so-called rare earths, and it'd be a safe bet that most people have never heard of them, let alone given them a second thought. Take a moment to think and look. Metal and their magic is all around you. Just think. Washing machines, fridges, the bus we go to work on, the ring we acknowledge our partner with, the tool we use to eat our lunch with, the invisible bit that makes our mobile phone work, the gilt bars we hide under our mattress, the stuff that forms Andy Scott's leopard at Marshall Square. To try and list all the situations we encounter in metal will take you a long time. Yet, like many things that make our modern life possible, we take their presence and availability for granted. Yet this wasn't always the case. Even some of the metals and alloys we think of always having been around are in fact quite recent arrivals. An example of such is stainless steel, which we'll come to later. However, let's start with the first metal mentioned in Kipling's poem, gold. Gold is a malleable element. That means you can make and decorate things from it relatively easily. It doesn't oxidize and importantly is relatively rare and shiny. It also usually occurs as a native metal rather than as most metals do as an ore. All these qualities made and still does make it attractive to people. Gold objects were early on accorded a special importance by people, an importance it retains today. Gold has been worked for at least 6,500 years. Evidence discovered at sites near Varna in Bulgaria supports this. Why Bulgaria? Short answer is we don't know for certain. However, Bulgaria is relatively rich in places where gold can be found, although the size of the individual deposits may be small. The earliest gold objects were made by simply beating the nuggets flat, then forming them into a desired shape. From their rarity in the archaeological record and the places where early gold objects have been found, it is likely that such objects were restricted to people who had a particularly high status or a special role in the society around Varna. It seems likely the gold items were placed as a type of badge that marked them out, so much so that the gold objects were actually put in their grave with them when they died. At that time, the people at Varna were interred. Stone and wood were still the dominant hard materials for making much of the equipment and tools that everyone used in their daily life. Coming west, and forward perhaps 1,000 years, we find gold being used in Scotland. Although there are known deposits of gold in streams and other places all over the country, there's still controversy as to where the ancient inhabitants obtained it. Although later in date, just as at Varna, we find decorative gold items being deposited in graves with certain individuals, which, like at Varna, would mark the individuals out and the metal itself as being significant. Interestingly, archaeologists have also discovered groups of gold artefacts which were cast deliberately into boggy pools and streams or placed in other places, like the torque from West Aberdeenshire here in Aberdeen Art Gallery Museums. Here, as in the discovery of later hoards of metalwork associated with human skulls at places such as Netherley or Cowsay, or at Braes of Gecht where local tales tell of a kelpie that guarded a treasure, such instances appear to uphold the idea that metal was a ritualized offering. Staying in Scotland, although similar evidence can be found in many parts of Europe, copper and copper alloys were also worked thousands of years ago. It seems that among the first items that were made in any numbers were axes. Yet hand in hand with making utility items like the axes, items for adorning the human body were demanded from the metalworkers. Also, just as gold was placed in the graves of certain individuals who had a particular status in society, this was also the case with items made from copper and its alloys from its first casting. From the outset, it seems metal, the ability to work and have access to it, as well as the places where it was worked, were seen as ambiguous, extraordinary, uncanny, often fickle, or even having a life force of their own. This is summed up in the Finnish epic, the Kalevala, Curse upon Iron. Iron stretches, spreads like rubber, trickles, flows like dripping spittle, oozing from the blazing furnace, flowing from the scorching fire. Iron, you're still soft and gentle. How have you yet to be tempered to make steel from harmless iron? Stainless steel, despite what most people think, is only a product of the last 100 years or so. We use it in many situations, from home kitchens to medical surgery, where it can withstand repeated sterilisation, high temperatures and not rust. At other times you may literally trample it underfoot as it escalates you several floors in a large building. Here, its high tensile strength is to the fore. Yet stainless steel as we now know it was developed by a French metallurgist, Léon Guillet, between 1904 and 1908, who was seeking to make our eating experience rust or scale-free, assuming you were, of course, not born with a silver spoon. His alloy of iron, nickel and chrome was resistant to oxidizing, that's rusting. However, he didn't fully recognise all the properties of his discovery, but in 1912 metallurgists and the military did. They were looking for a way to extend the life of their gun barrels, make them better, to withstand rapid, repeated firing and to take larger charge, so extending their range. Stainless steel, they found, was the ideal material to do this. So originally conceived as a benevolent material to improve everyday life, after August 1914, stainless steel becomes somewhat less benevolent. Steel of any form is of course an alloy of iron. Evidence for ironworking is ancient. In North and Sub-Saharan Africa it is much older than Northern Europe. Some Egyptian artefacts using iron are around 5,000 years old, although actually smelting with the ore came later. A man who was buried at Gersel in Egypt around 5,300 years ago, and Tutankhamun, who died about 3,300 odd years ago, had respectively some beads, and famously a knife buried with them, made of meteoric iron. Literally iron from the heavens. I'll leave you to ponder that yourself. Back on Earth, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, sites such as Obuí in the Central African Republic may have been actively processing iron ore as much as 4,000 years ago. Other places, such as those around the Mahun River in Burkina Faso and elsewhere, have dates slightly earlier, or roughly in line with that of Northern Europe. This makes many people to conclude that the techniques and knowledge of ferrous working and smelting may be the result of independent discovery in a variety of places, rather than a single eureka moment and the knowledge spreading away from that. Which begs the question, why did they all accord special significance to the material beyond it just being useful, unlike those that worked it in the disparate locations? To smelt iron ore and to work the resulting metal is a complex undertaking. It needs temperatures around 1300 C and around 1500 for casting, a supply of charcoal for the carbon, a good flow of air, the knowledge of temperatures and quantities of ore and carbon to achieve a good smelt, and how to construct a furnace in order to achieve the material effectively. In many societies, smiths are set apart by their rituals and their training. They're accorded high status among their fellows. Often smiths carry out important roles in society that have little to do with making metal things. Likewise, by extension, the places to perform their craft also become powerful, become special places. Among the Mandi peoples in West Africa, the working of iron is restricted to specific family lineages. Initiates undertake a long apprenticeship where they learn all the secret knowledge and the ritual required to become a master smith. Emma George Ross, in her essay, The Iron Age of West Africa, tells us that the Ife and Oyo kingdoms, iron had a significant ritual status in all these Nigerian states, in which the forge functioned both as a ritual shrine and a sanctuary. The anvil was often used for the taking of an oath, or as a sacrificial altar. Ironworking demanded great proximity to supernatural powers, thus as smiths were both admired and feared. Jumping rapidly east now to Japan, we'll have a quick look at the role of metal in the smith there. In Japan, metalwork was subject to a spirit guardian, Ame no Mai Totsu no Kami, and closely bound by belief and ritual. Thus, metalwork created under the influence of such powerful invisible forces came to be imbued with its own life force. When we look at the making of a traditional Japanese sword, this gives us a good insight into the processes and the belief contained in such acts of creation. On the completion of his task, the maker will submerge the piece in water. By doing so, part of his spirit or his life force is transferred to the metal. The actual making of swords in Japan was long and involved a process where a number of craftsmen undertook very specific tasks, from the forging of the steel to the final edging and polishing. Each craftsman imbued the sword with a part of their own life essence. Indeed, master craftsmen were seen to actively define the character of the items they produced. If he was seen as immoral, weak in mind or body, spiteful, those characteristics would be absorbed by these products. The weapons themselves were treasured heirlooms and often accorded names, and thought to be capable of passing on the wisdom and the spirit energy from its maker through subsequent owners to its most recent recipient. Coming back west again, echoes of the special place of iron and those who work it and the position they held in society can still be found. An example is knife grinders and polishers, who, like their Japanese counterparts, were specialists and often came from a lineage. Even then, novitiates would still have to undertake a long period of training before being considered a master grinder. Like their Japanese counterparts, Western knife grinders adhered to a number of taboos while active. One such was not working when the sun was setting. To do so was to provoke misfortune upon the grinder and the owner of the knife. This may stem from the idea that as the sun set, malevolent forces were freer to do their work. We've already seen elsewhere that metal workers were considered close to supernatural powers. A striking example of a smith in Scotland playing a role beyond the working of metal was described by Martin Martin in 1703 in his description of the Western Isles of Scotland. He witnessed a ceremony by a smith at Kilmartin in Skye, who healed people by laying the patient on the anvil, face upwards. The smith then seized a large hammer in both hands and, grimacing wildly, approached the sick person. He then raised the hammer and prepared to strike with all his might, so effecting a cure. Closer to Aberdeen and well into the 20th century, there was a secret society known as the Horseman's Word. The members were drawn from ironworkers, ploughmen, and stallion walkers. The highest-ranking members were thought to have supernatural powers of control over horses. The word that was embedded in the rituals of the group and passed on to initiates conferred special capabilities of seduction. It's no surprise that initiates had a reputation for sexual power and potency. Here it may be the link to the potency of stallions that conveyed the power. Nonetheless, it is interesting that the members specifically include the metal worker, while the initiation rituals also involve confronting the spirit world in the form of Satan, a connection that surfaces elsewhere in traditional Scottish belief, as do the links between metal and fertility. Weddings were once also performed by blacksmiths. The tradition is perhaps best known attached to the village of Gretna on the Scottish borders, but it was once more widespread and stemmed from the hand-fasting tradition of marriage. The famous tradition of the blacksmith sealing the marriage by striking his anvil led to the Gretna blacksmiths becoming known as anvil priests. Other obvious instances where iron is lucky is in the ideas attached to horseshoes, where the open ends must be kept uppermost or the luck will drop out. Now here again we have forms of fertility rearing its head, although in a female form, through the shape of the shoe itself. So it's no surprise that many women at their marriage carry a horseshoe, albeit of fabric or plastic, at a wedding. Originally, of course, it was as much the material used for the shoe as the shape that carried the magic. A last example of lucky or spiritual power of metal is from Orkney in the 1920s. John Firth tells of mothers who had just given birth would keep a Bible and a steel knife beside their bed, as this would prevent spirits or fairies from being able to approach and harm the infant, or worse, exchange them for a changeling. Iron was the active charm here as much as the Bible. It was with all this in mind that the flat pyramid was encountered at the Aberdeen Art Gallery. Like the material it is made from and the context it was created, it too has a mercurial quality, an ambiguity. It also seems deeply rooted in the past and in the landscape it sprang from. What follows can only be considered at best a scratch upon its layers of meaning and significance, but we'll put it in a bit of context. Gerald Laing created a number of sculptures around the time he set up home in the 16th century tower house just south of Dingwall and began restoring it in the early 70s. Flat Pyramid is one of these. It is made of steel, set upon a Caithness flagstone. It shows a slice-like, low-angled pyramid shape surmounted by a pillar-like structure, the two elements having an arched void at the base which echoes that of the pillar form. Laing was also had a long-standing interest in custom cars, and the way the sculpture is put together makes a reference to the metalworking techniques of customizing those vehicles. But there's more. Laing himself around this time had become interested in accessing through abstraction the permanence of and ancient resource presented by monuments in the landscape, and exploring this in his work. He had already been moving towards abstraction in sculptural form for some time, as a way of shedding the pop genre he had been working in whilst in London and the US. His self-isolation from the international art set, following his move to Conkill, proved fertile. The landscape that Laing found himself living in was one full of monuments from earlier ages, albeit more modest than his tower house. Elements from some of the megalithic settings, such as Callanish and the stone circles around about him, found their way into his work at this time. whilst abstract monuments were juxtaposed upon semi-abstract landscapes in his tapestry works. Flat pyramid can be seen as a reference to this, but it can also be superficially seen as a reference to pyramids of ancient Egypt and the Mesoamerican culture. The latter figures in a tapestry that is roughly contemporary with flat pyramid and carries a banner headline proclaiming it as an American pyramid. Both these monumental forms of structure have come to symbolize permanence, immortality, power, and spiritual potency. They are, to put it crudely, permanent monuments in their environment. Yet Laing was alluding to much more than monumentality alone. He spoke about the flattened aspect of his sculpture as alluding to gravity, a reference to gravity. Pyramids in both Mesoamerica, where they're thought of as pivots around which the world revolves, and Egypt, where they represent the primordial heap from which the world was created, both types of structure carry gravity, creation, and life force at their core. Laing was also deeply interested in his craft and its place in the landscape around him. Kinkell, where he lived, is surrounded by vestiges of ancient people, and the landscape is dotted with early metalworking sites known as bloomeries. These latter often just appear as a conical, pyramid-shaped forms in a hillside or wood now. However, upon excavation, they are shown to have a structure akin to the experimental furnace shown earlier, down to its aperture at the base. Perhaps we are now back where we started. The apartness of the worker from the community through the craft they practice. A material capable of radical transformation, a material that is deeply rooted in the remote past, its creation linked to the very creation of Earth itself. A material, elemental in substance, and deeply rooted in our psyche, just like the form that Laing created.